Okay, it's May 15th, 2020. George Webb here on the Diplomatic Back Channel, the beautiful Potomac. I just saw Paul Cottrell's interview with Dr. Judy Mikovits. It's 3 hours long. It's certainly the most complete interview out there on the web. And I did have a chance to give Paul some questions for Dr. Judy and did have a chance to talk with him along the way and ask questions and so forth, also with Farmer Jones, who you may know as Alex on his YouTube channel. So what we're trying to do is get to a model that everyone can understand, trying to get to the science, get all the information out, but then get to a model that everyone can understand and go, oh, I get it. I see what's happening. If you watch the 3 hours, which I encourage everybody to do, it goes into far more detail than her book, Plague of Corruption, which is #1 on the Amazon bestseller list and also climbing the charts on the New York Times bestseller list. And of course, this movie, Plandemic, is also very high on the YouTube charts, if you will. But the model she has in one of her slides is called the Bassomatic. This is the blender, basically, from Saturday Night Live fame. And what she has is all these dead mouse organs going into a big vat, a big blender. And they're liver tissues, they're different disease tissues, which can then be blended up and then in small quantities can be attenuated to give you just enough reaction if it's injected into you into a vaccine for you to develop the antibodies, And the concentration of the live virus is attenuated virus is such that it doesn't kill you. It gives you a little tiny reaction, but it doesn't kill you. So that's the idea of vaccines produced from a virus. But her central thesis is that there's 32 of these toxins in this one cell line that she's talking about. Could be more than that, called these xenotropic retroviruses, XMRVs. And there's probably more viruses than that when you hear my model. But this mouse Bassomatic picture is the thing that'll stick out in your mind when you see her lecture. And then you see a physician drawing off the distillate, if you will, it's in a blue color. The mouse being spun up in the vat is in a red color, like a blood color, and then the distillate's this blue color, and it's being drawn off into a syringe and then being injected into a baby. Why? Because, well, that's when we're supposed to vaccinate to protect the baby for the longest possible time. But it's also being injected into a human with the weakest immune system against if this vaccine was carrying other viruses. If you had a contaminated vat, if you will, you may be killing a lot of babies. And we've seen a lot of evidence of this. The measles MMR vaccine in India, with Bill Gates being thrown out of India for killing so many babies, is probably the best, most known example, but there's a lot of examples like this in Africa and so forth. The early vaccines for polio, the Oxner vaccines, were very deadly before we got to the Salk vaccine and the oral Sabin vaccine. So this happens a lot. This is not unusual. You may have seen the movie Vaxxed. This is this raging debate between vax and anti-vax. I'm neither one. I'm safe vax. So the key model is this mouse model. And her thesis is that a whole bunch of stuff got thrown into the vat that wasn't checked for, wasn't purified. And so then after this vaccine is drawn off, for every lab using it from then on for their studies, you buy these serums, these blood serums that have this from these different manufacturers to study different things. If you want to study kidneys, you buy the cell line for the kidneys. If you want to study livers, you buy the cell line for the livers. If you want to study the stomach and maladies, you get the stomach cells. You get the idea. And her general thesis is every time you do these studies and then you come out with a vaccine for whatever you're vaccinating for, you're reproducing all the other things that you're not screening for. So you may be solving one problem, but because there's 32 or 31 other of these xenotropic retrovirus, you're in solving a big problem with the first virus, but you're creating 32 little problems out in the population. So you're maybe protecting 3% of the population from dying, but you're infecting everyone of the remaining part of the population, the remaining 97%, with 30 or 31 or 32 of these other flavors, if you will. And that's her central thesis. And I think I got that right. And what I want to do with Paul is go through a discussion with him and then play it back to Dr. Judy and have her comment about our digest, if you will. But if you really boil everything down that she says, it's all the things that have happened to her legally and professional attacks and so forth, really all boil down to suppression of that fact, that there are these contaminants or impurities in the vaccine that cause all these different diseases. Now, I had said a long time ago that if you look at the history, again, not the science, but if you look at the history now of how Fort Detrick was created, it basically took all the deadly pathogens, both bacteria and viruses, from the Japanese program, Unit 731, and brought them to Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland. And it took Kurt Blom's viruses and from the Nazi program in Pirna, Pirna. Again, I did this show 3 years ago, but from Pirna, and brought them here. And you have a bunch of pathogens on the shelf. How easy would it have been to say, hey, if polio's here, we need to have a monopoly going forward, let's put 31, let's attenuate 31 of these things and throw it in there. So that we're kind of guaranteed, it's kind of the opposite of guaranteed obsolescence, it's guaranteed need down the track for either cancer treatments or what have you, all these different diseases. And there's evidence to support that. Again, 3 years ago, I did a show about this equine anemia. This is a horse virus. And then there's Eastern equine, also not anemia, but fatigue, where I start the show with saying that in the beginning, the horse is tired. And I say that this could be the precursor to chronic fatigue syndrome. A lot of these Epstein's Barr or a lot of these other syndromes kind of seem to trace their way back to these equine viruses that could have only come from Kurt Blom's lab in Pirna. And it's just sort of all thrown into the vat in Fort Detrick. The only thing you would need at that point is somebody to leave the door open at Fort Detrick to then get it out of Fort Detrick, which happened in August of 2019 before this attack. Somebody to go back to take it to the stores in Isfahan or wherever the Borman Brotherhood ended up storing all their viruses until they could find a buyer between Russia and the United States after the end of World War II. You'd only need one Sina Bavari to take advantage of 4 different joint ventures. You'd only need one different Sina Bavari to shut down the NATO courier program, the tracking of these couriers moving these blood pathogens around. You'd only need one. A Peter Strzok would only need one Sina Bavari to affect what's happening now in the world. The same thing that happened, as much as people want to call this conspiracy theory, this happened with HIV. I'll repeat that. This happened with HIV. There was a contaminated bloodline that went out. So this happened with HIV. I'm very familiar with the legal team that worked on this case with the American Red Cross for the contaminated blood that had the HIV virus in the blood. And it was denied for a long time. At least 1 million people in that case. And there was a huge settlement. At that time, American Red Cross was based in Portland, Oregon. So now Dr. Judy says that not only was there HIV in that blood, but there's all these other XMRVs. And since you're not testing for the XMRVs, because you say the problem just has gone away, you keep making the problem worse. Her estimates are that the number's up to 25 million with these 32 different things. So those are the big ideas. As soon as I saw Eastern equine for the horse is tired, And as soon as I saw equine anemia, I thought of SARS, COVID-2. I thought of COVID-19 because it's the same sort of anemia that's produced. And again, these scientists back then, Kurt Blom and so forth, didn't have the benefit of DNA. They only had the benefit of going out to the farm, the animal farm, and looking for new diseases, and then watching the pathology of the disease, and then slaughtering the horse and vivisecting the horse when they're done, and taking the organ that looks most contaminated, and then chopping that up, and then feeding it to pigs, or feeding it to then mice after it's fed by the pigs, and seeing if they can recreate the pathology. That's what they did back then. And they had hundreds, and they used humans, they used Jews for the human testing. They didn't need monkey labs. These different concentration camps were monkey labs, only they were the human guinea pigs for these products. So again, Nazis at the end of the war, that's your intellectual property. Are you going to just throw it all away? Or are you going to say, we will triumph again? We will be like the phoenix. We'll rise out of the ashes. We'll negotiate to get all these pathogens to Fort Detrick. We're not going to give everything. We're not going to show all of our cards. We'll hold some things back in Isfahan. But over time, we'll be able to introduce these things because we hold all the cards. We know the genetic sequence. And if you, some people say, well, now we have BLAST. BLAST is a search tool, basically like Google. BLAST is a search tool that geneticists can use and say, oh, here's a sequence that we know about for, let's say, this XMRV. We'll just search for it. We'll see if anything is contaminated. And the search comes back negative. Well, it must be good. You know, ready to inject this into little babies. Look at how the glycoprotein 120 was hidden in the genome of the coronavirus. You basically separate it into 4 units. So your 4-syllable word, for instance, separated into 4 different syllables. And then you have what's called a chaperone protein. Let's call the hand the chaperone here, the thumb, chaperoning them all together back into the final protein that you need. But if you just looked at the 4 fingers, you would say, well, that doesn't look like a hand. You're searching for the whole hand. You're not searching for any one of the 4 inserts. That could be very well how this was hidden for all the XMRVs or all the viruses using the chaperone protein. Using the chaperone protein could have been a way that, in an odd way, coronavirus may have just given us the key to how the XMRVs have been hidden for decades. So, interesting new phenomenon now that we have the CRISPR technology, we can see this. Again, we need more of a multivariate search that searches for small segments of a coding protein, looking for amino acid, maybe let's say 2 or 3 amino acids in contiguously, like you would search for a codon, like you would search for a start codon or a stop codon. And more sophisticated search will probably elucidate these embedded viruses, allowing also for genetic change. So it's a little bit more complicated than just a straight search for exact match. But a fuzzy search should be able to find this. And I think she's onto something here. And the reason is, I saw the equine anemia. That would never be in any of these cell lines, right? I saw the Eastern equine, the sleeping sickness, that precursor to chronic fatigue syndrome. And I said, this is maybe just this easy. Is in order to make sure they had a monopoly and make sure they had to franchise these doctors who knew what went into the vat, threw it all into the vat unbeknownst, threw the 32 different pathogens into the vat without telling the people at Fort Detrick that they were going to be amplifying that and spreading that. That could be a way. Remember, everyone says, well, you're assigning dark motives to Nazis. You're assigning dark motives to Nazis. Think about that before you accuse me of that again. I'm assigning dark motives to Nazis? These are people who came up with Zyklon B. These are people who work people to death to come out with a better airplane wing or a rocket, to put the electronics in the V2 rocket at middle work. They kill people in the millions. They wouldn't pour 32 vials into, remember, we brought Kurt Blom over here to Fort Detrick. They wouldn't pour 32 vials in the concoction to ensure a lifetime legacy franchise? Something to think about. Like I said, when I saw the equine anemia and I saw the Eastern equine, I said, those are Kurt Blom's. Those are his signatures. Those are his fingerprints on this. And we could be suffering from this legacy. She makes a very good point. Dr. Judy makes a very good point. If you don't test for it, if you don't have a sophisticated search tool that takes into account the chaperoning, that the slight spacing of these 4 different segments of glycoprotein 120, if you don't have a search engine that takes that into account, you replicate the virus. You pass it on, which is exactly what we don't want to do. So I will put out a more detailed analysis with Paul Cottrell, but this is the initial look. I think the big takeaway is the model. The myospasmatic is a good model, and if you don't test for it, you're not going to find it. Judy Mikovits with the 32 different XMRVs. We'll pick it up there next time with Paul Cottrell.